So we are still in chapter 4, justice towards the Creator. We talked about marriage and how that gives God justice. And now we are talking about vocation. The first section under vocation, the section we'll cover in this video, is the concept of justice towards the Creator. What does it mean to give God justice? And this discussion will be developed in later sections, but this section will talk about one specific point. And so in the previous section, we talked about how marriage is justified before society. Like in marriage, we give children, and that makes it good for society. And we talked about how sexual relations between a couple, like how that works. You can't use each other. So all of that are examples of what John Paul II calls horizontal justice. It's about our relationship with each other, the relationship between people. And so justice towards the Creator is about vertical justice. How is marriage justified in the eyes of the Creator? How do we justify marriage before God? And so that's vertical justice, not about our relationship with each other, but about what we give to God. And so we have to give God what belongs to Him. So how do we do that with marriage? And the main point of this section, justice, the concept of justice towards the Creator, is this. When we consciously participate in how God designed things, then we are, in a sense, being just towards God. So God made us to treat each other with love. And so when we do that according to God's design, then we are giving justice to God. So by treating the other with love and relating to Him in that way, using sex and marriage with love as God designed it, we choose to do it according to His design. That's giving justice to God. Because unlike other things in this world, humans don't just participate in this world passively. We think about things, we choose to do things, or we refuse to do things. Other things, like a rock, it can't choose to not be there. It just is there. And just by being there, it fulfills God's design. Even animals, they act instinctively, but by acting according to their instincts and just eating, mating, reproducing, running around, they fulfill God's design for them. But human beings, we do not just participate in this world passively. We don't just let our emotions move us. We actually consciously participate willingly or refuse with our will. And so with our will and consciousness, we choose to participate in God's design. Then that's what John Paul II is talking about here. He uses the word in Latin, particeps creatoris, kind of talking about the Creator's participation, being participants. So when we are consciously and will, loving others, he's talking most specifically about loving. He designed us to love. And so when we choose to do that according to design, we were made to love, we were made for love. So when we do that in sex and marriage, we are giving God justice. And so this is the sense of participating in creation, being the Creator's participants. That's reflected in sex and procreation in marriage. We've talked previously about how between humans it's not just reproduction but procreation, and they do this in the context of a marriage that is open to life and that relationship of love. And this fits in the framework of doing justice to God and our consciousness and willing participation in His designs. This next section is titled Mystical and Physical Virginity. And so in the previous section, we talked about how, in one sense, justice regarding sexual relations can be given to God. We're being just towards God when, with our sexual relations, we use it according to God's design. Being open to life, loving each other. When we're doing that, we're in a sense being just towards God. But another sense, we're still not really being just, because if I really want to give God what belongs to Him, I owe Him everything. He created me. And like nothing would be if God didn't create, if God wasn't the foundation. His love keeps us in existence. And so even if I were to give him everything, it still wouldn't be perfect justice. But we can try to give God ourselves, but the surrender that I, as a man, can make to God, it shouldn't be thought of as an act of justice, although, it can, try to be, but it's technically not. But it can be thought of as an act of love. That's more proper. He says self-giving has other roots, not justice, but love, because love allows the human being to be closer to God than by justice. Love wants union with God. Justice doesn't really strive for that. Justice wants to give God what belongs to him, but love is not really about saying, yeah, I want to, do what I'm supposed to be doing, but love is about, I want to be one with you. And so he allows us to love because we can't really be perfectly just. And this is the context in which we must understand virginity. Okay? So in this context of trying to give ourselves to God, not out of justice because we can't be perfectly just towards God, but out of love, wanting to give ourselves completely. That's really what virginity is about. So physical virginity is the external expression of this complete belonging to God. And he says this happens under the influence of grace. And to really point out what's important about virginity, he makes a distinction between physical virginity and mystical virginity. And physical virginity is obviously talking about just the physical fact of being a virgin, but the essence of it is the more mystical virginity, which is the pledge of conjugal love, pledge to God. There can be physical virginity or celibacy without that essence, that conscious, willing offering of conjugal love to God. I sacrifice that bodily love to God. And this is obviously reflected in priestly celibacy. There's a practical component, he says, to priestly celibacy. If I'm not married, I'm more able to, serve others. I'm more available. I'm less tied down. But there's a spiritual aspect to this priestly celibacy, which is really about that desire to give myself completely to God. And if I reflect on this as a priest, what really drives me to appreciate this celibacy? If it's just about, okay, I don't have an intimate relationship with a woman, so I sacrifice that and, I get to do a lot for people. That's good too, but if it's truly about that love for God I have, wanting to give myself, sacrifice myself complete to God, there's more strength and beauty there. So, that's something that John Paul II points out in this section. And he also makes a point that it should be our first choice, not second choice. And marriage didn't work out, or I couldn't find anybody, so then I'll be celibate. That's not really how it works. So we want to make God truly our first choice if we want that virginity to be meaningful. Obviously, most people are, called to marriage. They're not called to celibate. But does that mean they're choosing another human being over God? No, not necessarily. It can mean that, but in most cases, it could be that they're called. This is their calling, and that's their means to love God. That need for a betrothed love to give oneself and unite with another person, it's deeper than what just happens on a natural level. It's connected with the spiritual existence of the person. You're supposed to want that longing, that union with another person. That's how God designed you. So you are acting according to, God's designs. But the marriage, though, it is something temporal. It is about this world, trying to mirror God's love with two people in this world. The spiritual virginity more closely resembles that final union that we will have with God. When we're in heaven, even Christ said this in scripture, we're no longer given to marriage. So that final union we have with God is going to be greater than this earthly union between man and woman. But the man and woman union in this world. But spiritual virginity, to somebody who truly lives out that vocation, it more closely resembles what relationships in heaven will be like. There's two extremes. One is to reduce virginity to people who are incapable of marriage or family life. Like virginity, something weird just because they can't live normal married life. That's a way of looking at it very negatively. The other extreme is to say, like spiritual values are more important than physical values. And, when you get into that mindset, you're kind of going into the early church heresy, which said material stuff is bad, spiritual stuff good. No, it's all good. The value of virginity is about not so much about earthly stuff bad, because there's goodness in the earthly marriage and procreation. There's something divine there. But the value of virginity is about realizing the kingdom of God on earth and really trying to be a symbol as a response to God's call of that final union we will have with God. Okay, the next subheading is titled The Problem of Vocation. I don't know why he calls it a problem. We've seen this heading previously. The problem of reciprocity, and I think it was once elsewhere too. I don't know if that's just how Polish people talk, but he calls this section the problem of vocation. Perhaps it's he says that because maybe it's a problem that people don't realize the concept of a vocation. I don't know. But he begins with the observation that vocation is something that's applied specifically to people. Animals don't have a sense of what they're called to do. Birds don't go, I'm called to fly, so I will fly. No, like a calling is something that's specific to humans, and it's because humans have that interiority and a capacity to love. Like those are things that are tied to vocation. Like we're able to have an interior sense of what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to love, and fulfill our function. So the vocation implies a rational response to a sense of being called. And there is a sense of being called by those around us. He even mentions, I think, priesthood in this section, how it is technically the bishop who calls and people, the church, but that's the social element. But there's also a sense that's personal and psychological, that's kind of more interior to you. And he says there's a proper course for every person's development to follow. I'm supposed, as I grow towards being a man, there's a proper course that I'm supposed to go. And he calls that personal and psychological dimension of this vocation. And as we follow that proper course, our love is fixed on a particular goal. Okay? So he says, yes, we strive to love in a particular direction, but to love isn't enough. There must be a sense of commitment, like I'm committed to this love, and I must be prepared to give myself for love. So giving myself, not just loving, but giving myself in a committed way. So that's proper for a vocation. And he said here, there's this line in here that he says, the person fulfills itself most effectively when it gives itself most fully. So when I give myself fully, that's when I am fulfilled. And there's a famous Vatican II line in one of the major documents. Man cannot find himself through a sincere gift of self. Maybe John Paul II, when he was a young bishop, made that contribution. Who knows? So John Paul II in this text exhorts the reader to understand marriage or celibacy from this perspective. Being called, what I'm supposed to do and commit myself. Because if you don't have that perspective, marriage just becomes about the body and sex, and even celibacy becomes something just merely about something practical or even odd. And we lose that in sense of what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to live out marriage or celibacy if we don't have a sense of vocation. And then he concludes by tying this to the New Testament, because ultimately it's God who calls. That call to self-perfection through love, it comes from God. And it's not just about like myself and what I want to be. And grace, God's grace, is at work to take me beyond myself. Okay, and this last subheading under vocation is paternity and maternity. So earlier we talked about the idea of procreation versus reproduction, and this section gets a little more into that discussion. And so there's a great emphasis on spiritual parenthood as opposed to biological parenthood. In a natural level, being a parent comes much more naturally to a woman than for a man. If we just look at the body and like the physiology, the woman, it's understandable. The woman literally gives birth from her body. She feeds the child from her body, and so it comes more naturally to her. For a man, it requires more cultivation, more effort, more intentional effort. And we could see that in society as well. So in the discussion of the value of being parents, and John Paul II gives special attention to the interior formation, right? Like, it's not just about giving birth to a child, feeding a child. Those are physical aspects, but the interior formation of a child. When you think about a human person, a person is much more interior than a body. Okay? Both body and soul make up the human person, but what goes on interiorly is what's really important. What makes a person more a person, that interiority that a person has. And so giving formation to that interiority, there's great value there. And so spiritual parenthood, that's what he is trying to get at. That interior formation, beyond just biological giving birth and feeding and all that. So that spiritual parenthood is more significant than physical parenthood. And when somebody's being a spiritual parent, really paying attention to the interior, the person's soul, parenthood. And so being a father and a mother on a biological level, on a natural level, can be different. But on a spiritual level, being a father and mother is pretty much a lot more similar, because spiritually trying to nurture the child and form the person spiritually, interiorly, that's where the more important aspect of parenthood comes into play. And a father and mother can do that much more similar. Parenthood is a symptom, he says, of a person's maturity. When somebody receives a love stemming from that, they receive something special. So for example, a priest would be a spiritual parent, right? Spiritual father. And so a spiritual father who's mature in his love, gives that love to his flock, then the flock that receives that love receives something special. And that spiritual kinship is stronger, he says, than blood kinship. So of course, in many cases with good families, parents are both, they provide parent both on that blood physical level and the spiritual level. But in many cases, there are cases, of course, in which their parent can be a parent biologically, but not really feed their child spiritually or give them love interiorly. And so that's why he says spiritual kinship is stronger than just blood kinship. And he ends by talking about how God is a prototype of spiritual parenthood. On a natural level, a mother and a father are the ideal models of what love is. But spiritually speaking, God is obviously the much greater model. When the spiritual parenthood is modeled after God's, fatherhood, then that is the ultimate ideal and prototype.